The real reason the British Parliament burned to the ground in 1834 had nothing to do with a simple accident. It was the result of a desperate attempt to destroy the evidence of how money actually works. The air in the basement of the Palace of Westminster is thick, stagnant, and smells of old damp stone. It is the late afternoon of October 16th. London is grey, cold, and bustling with the noise of the Industrial Revolution. But down here, in the dark beneath the House of Lords, it is completely quiet. A clerk named Richard Weebly is standing in front of the heating furnaces. Next to him are two laborers, leaning on their shovels. Behind them sit two massive wooden carts, piled high with tens of thousands of split wooden sticks. Weebly has been given a very simple bureaucratic order: dispose of the sticks. These pieces of wood are called tallies. For centuries, the British Empire did not run on gold or silver. It ran on these sticks. They were essentially physical ledgers, carved with notches to represent pounds, shillings, and pence, the original hidden money of England.
But the system has been modernized. The paper ledgers of the Bank of England have taken over. The sticks are obsolete. Instead of giving the wood away to the poor for heating, Weebly decides to simply incinerate them, right here, in the furnaces of the government. He orders the laborers to start shoveling. They throw the sticks into the fire, thousands of them. The heat builds. It builds so intensely that the copper lining of the flues begins to melt. The brickwork turns white hot. Upstairs, politicians notice the floorboards are uncomfortably warm. Smoke begins to bleed through the tapestries. A few hours later, the roof of the House of Lords erupts into a massive column of fire. The government was disposing of an obsolete record-keeping system and accidentally burned Parliament to the ground in the process. When you look at that fire, you are looking at an uncomfortable reality about how our civilization tracks value. We are taught to look at money as something strictly physical. We read textbooks that tell a very comforting, logical story. The story goes like this. In the ancient world, human beings used a barter system. A man had a cow, and he wanted some shoes. So he had to find a cobbler who happened to want a cow. It was inefficient. So to solve this problem, communities invented money, coins acting as a medium of exchange. It makes perfect logical sense. But anthropological research suggests that pure barter economies may have never existed. In 1985, Cambridge anthropologist Caroline Humphrey noted that extensive studies of ancient societies failed to turn up a single example of a pure barter system. Before the first coin was ever struck, ancient communities operated on deeply complex, unwritten ledgers of credit and debt. If you needed shoes, the cobbler gave them to you. In the mind of the village, you were in a deficit and he was in a surplus. Money was not necessarily invented to facilitate direct trade. It was formalized to keep track of debt. Debt came first, and the glowing numbers you see on your phone today are just the digital descendants of those burning wooden sticks. The ink on the parchment takes a moment to dry in the cold air. It is $12.99. We are in Provence, France, in a dimly lit merchant office belonging to the Giovanni Ferrolfi and Company. Sitting at a heavy oak desk is a financial manager named Amatino Manucci. Luca Pacioli would become globally famous for publishing the Rules of Modern Accounting in 1494. But surviving records show that nearly 200 years earlier, in the quiet solitude of this room, Manucci was already practicing something profoundly significant: double-entry bookkeeping. He draws a line down the center of his ledger. On the left, debits. On the right, credits. He operates on a mathematical principle that will become the inescapable architecture of modern commerce. For every asset that exists on one side of the ledger, a corresponding liability must exist on the other. Manucci did not just track shipments of wool and spices. He utilized a framework where financial wealth cannot exist in a vacuum. Under this accounting system, credit is fundamentally linked to a corresponding deficit. By 1557, this mathematical reality confronted the most powerful man on earth, King Philip II of Spain. Philip was the master of a global empire. His ships were crossing the Atlantic, returning from the Americas heavily loaded with plundered gold and silver. By all basic logic, Spain should have been unstoppably wealthy. It held massive reserves of physical currency. But Philip had fought sprawling, expensive wars. To fund them, he had borrowed heavily from elite German and Italian banking families. Philip sat in his palace, surrounded by physical mountains of precious metals, and realized it wasn't enough. The interest on his loans was compounding faster than the ships could sail. The mathematical reality of the ledger had outpaced the physical reality of the gold. In 1557, Philip declared the first modern sovereign default. Spain was bankrupt despite its vast reserves. Over the next few centuries, the Spanish Empire would default 14 times, proving that even a king's wealth is subordinate to the math of compounding interest. Fast forward to 1781. The air in Philadelphia is thick with humidity and desperation. The American Revolution is struggling. The newly formed United States government has almost zero financial credibility. It cannot print money that anyone trusts, and it struggles to issue debt that anyone will buy. The nation is on the verge of financial collapse. Alexander Hamilton is widely remembered as the architect of American finance, but Superintendent of Finance Robert Morris is the one who stepped into the immediate void.
Looking at a crumbling economy, Morris realized the government could not secure its own funding. So he personally financed the Bank of North America by issuing Morris notes, paper backed entirely by his own mercantile shipping wealth and personal credit. The United States government managed to stay financially afloat in its earliest days because one wealthy merchant leveraged his own personal standing to bridge the gap. The concept of leveraging the future has always required creative legal phrasing. The wind howls across a bleak English estate in the late 12th century. A minor nobleman is staring at his fields. He needs capital to survive the winter and approaches a wealthy lender. But there is a problem. The medieval Christian church strictly forbids usury. Charging interest is a severe offense. But legal scholars of the era drafted a workaround. They called it a vaudium, or a pledge. If the nobleman handed over his land to the lender could harvest the crops and keep the profits. If the profits from those crops counted toward paying down the original loan, it was called a vivum vaudium, a living pledge. But lenders often wanted a more profitable arrangement. In this alternative contract, the lender kept the crops and the profits, but none of it reduced the principal of the loan. The nobleman still owed the exact original amount. In the Old French dialect of the era, they named this specific instrument the mortgage, the dead pledge. Centuries later, millions of people sit in brightly lit bank branches and sign 30-year agreements to secure a home, completely unaware of the medieval translation of the word printed at the top of their contract. In January 1835, Andrew Jackson is sitting in the White House. He is a man of intense conviction who deeply distrusts paper money and the Second Bank of the United States. He views national debt as a fundamental vulnerability. So he does something unprecedented. He pays it off. By selling off massive tracts of government land and vetoing spending bills, Jackson zeroes out the national debt and dismantles the central bank. But in doing so, he removed the primary regulatory anchor holding the financial system steady. State and local banks suddenly found themselves without federal oversight. They began wildly printing unbacked paper money and extending reckless lines of credit to land speculators. Realizing the economy was overheating, Jackson issued the Specie Circular in 1836, a sudden demand that government land must be bought with physical gold and silver. The music stopped instantly. The speculators didn't have the gold. The local banks didn't have the gold. Credit evaporated, and the ledgers collapsed. The result was the Panic of 1837, one of the most devastating economic depressions in U.S. history. Jackson proved a difficult economic reality. In a system where the money supply is deeply intertwined with credit, rapidly eliminating all debt can violently contract the economy. Over the decades, various thinkers have tried to propose alternative foundations for money. In 1921, Henry Ford and Thomas Edison stood at the edge of the Wilson Dam in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. They watched the massive rush of water pouring through the concrete turbines. They proposed an unconventional idea to Congress.
Instead of backing currency with gold or issuing it through bank credit, they wanted to issue an energy dollar. This currency would be backed by the actual thermodynamic output of the dam, a system rooted in physics and the irrefutable laws of energy. Ford's proposal bears an intriguing conceptual resemblance to the energy-backed logic later associated with the proof-of-work mathematics of Bitcoin. Congress ultimately blocked the proposal, and the energy dollar never materialized. 11 years later, the Great Depression is suffocating the global economy. In the small Austrian town of Worgel, the factories are closed and unemployment is soaring. Mayor Michael Unterguckenberger realized the problem was not a lack of physical resources. The town had lumber, workers, and infrastructure needs. The problem was a lack of circulating currency. People were hoarding the little money they had out of fear. He introduced a localized currency called stamp squip, utilizing a concept known as demurrage. Every month you held onto this money, it lost a fraction of its face value. Citizens literally had to buy a stamp and stick it on the bill to keep it valid. It was essentially a currency with a negative interest rate.
The psychology shifted instantly. Hoarding money became a financial penalty. The citizens of Worgel began spending the scrip rapidly. They paid taxes in advance and hired neighbors for repairs. The town paved roads and built bridges, and unemployment plummeted while the rest of Europe remained economically stagnant. The experiment was highly successful locally, but the Austrian central bank recognized it as a threat to their exclusive legal right to issue currency. They took legal action, criminalized the local scrip, and the town returned to the national monetary system. During the banking collapse of 1933, a group of prominent economists, including Henry Simons and Irving Fisher, drafted a memorandum that became known as the Chicago Plan. They proposed making fractional reserve banking illegal, requiring banks to hold 100% reserves against deposits. This would have effectively ended the ability of private banks to create money through lending. President Franklin D. Roosevelt opted instead for the regulatory framework of the Glass-Steagall Act. The reliance on credit only deepened. In 1946, a banker in Brooklyn named John Biggins introduced a localized, closed-loop credit system called Charge It. It allowed residents to buy goods at local merchants, with the bank paying the bill and collecting the debt from the consumer later. 4 years before the Diners Club became famous, Biggins quietly laid the groundwork for the modern credit card, creating a seamless psychological bridge between daily consumption and ongoing debt. As the decades passed, the ledger expanded beyond borders. It is 1957. The Cold War is escalating. In Paris, inside the Banque Commerciale pour l'Europe du Nord, a telex machine is quietly humming. This is a Soviet-owned bank operating in France. The Kremlin had accumulated US dollars from selling commodities, but feared depositing them in American banks, worrying the US government might freeze their accounts during a political dispute. So they deposited their dollars in this Paris bank, outside the direct jurisdiction of the Federal Reserve. The bank's telex address was Eurobank. This maneuver helped give birth to the Eurodollar, a US dollar deposited in a bank outside the United States. It allowed global corporations and foreign banks to lend and multiply dollar-denominated assets internationally, creating a vast, unregulated offshore dollar market.
The global financial system grew incredibly complex, relying on the assumption of seamless, unbreakable execution. But step into a U.S. government office in April 1979. Amidst political gridlock over the debt ceiling, a literal mechanical failure occurred on a Wang word processor in the Treasury Department. Because of this equipment glitch and back-office delays, the United States Treasury accidentally missed payments on $122 million worth of Treasury bills. Investors sued. The U.S. credit rating was briefly dinged, and the delay cost taxpayers billions in higher interest rates. The complex architecture of global finance was briefly disrupted by a broken piece of office equipment. The consequences of debt can reshape entirely sovereign states. In 1933, the Dominion of Newfoundland was a proud, self-governing country with its own parliament and prime minister. But burdened by massive railway debts and the financial toll of World War I, it was facing default. Interest payments were consuming more than half of the government's revenue. To secure a financial bailout, the government of Newfoundland did something extraordinary. They voluntarily dissolved their own democracy. They relinquished self-rule, suspending their government and handing control to an unelected commission appointed by the British Crown. Their political independence was surrendered to restructure their sovereign debt. This relationship between freedom and financial obligation is older than written history. Around 2400 BC, in the ancient plains of Mesopotamia, the Sumerian ruler Enmetena of Lagash inscribed a decree on a clay tablet. It is the very first time in the recorded history of humanity that the concept of freedom appears in a political document.
But Enmetena was not writing about voting rights. He was writing a debt jubilee. He decreed that all debts were canceled and that citizens forced into debt slavery to pay off loans were immediately released. The Sumerian word he used for this freedom was amargi. It translates literally to return to mother, because the debt slaves were finally allowed to pack their belongings, walk out of the fields of their creditors, and go home. When you trace the history of this system, from the burned tallies of the British Parliament to the dead pledges of the Middle Ages to the credit cards in Brooklyn and the glitches in the digital Treasury, you begin to understand the true nature of the ledger. Money is, at its core, a social agreement. The system can turn future labor into present purchasing power, and that creates a very different relationship with debt. We wake up and trade our physical labor, our time, and our energy for a unit of account. Tomorrow morning, you will open your phone. You will log into your banking app. You will see a number on a screen. You will feel a sense of security if the number is high. You will feel a knot of anxiety if the number is low. But stand in the silence of your room and look closely at that glowing screen. There is no physical vault holding your wealth. There is only a record, a deeply complex, thousands-year-old psychological agreement linking your past labor to your future obligations. And the number on that screen